It's that time of the year again, for Australia anyway, where the last exams of the year are coming up. And for a lot of people, that might mean thinking about what you want to do next year. If you're a year 12 student, you might be thinking what uni you want to go to, what course you want to study, if you want to go at all. And if you're a third year uni student, you might be thinking about the decision to study further or look for work. So in this video, I want to share the pros and cons of taking a gap year, as well as some things to consider when thinking about whether you do want to take 1 year off. This is, of course, based on my experiences of taking a gap year after high school and also after honours. So regardless of what education and life stage you're at, if you've ever considered taking a gap year, stick around. So first of all, I think it's really good to come to a decision about whether or not to take a gap year by first starting to think about the reasons for why you want to take a gap year and thinking about whether it will actually achieve what you are hoping it will achieve. So in other words, being clear about what you expect out of a gap year. I think overall, like, this time off will be as good or as worthwhile as you make it to be. I personally had several good reasons for taking a gap year after high school, and each of those reasons stacked highly against the decision to just go straight to uni. And in the end, was it worth it? Yes. There are some things I wish I could have done slightly differently, but overall, let's say I fulfilled most of my reasons for taking a gap year in the first place. Now, there are caveats to having expectations, but I'll get to them more in the second half of the video. Finances. So the main reason for why I personally wanted to take a gap year was because I wanted to be prepared as much as possible for university. And because I was moving interstate, I wanted to save money and get settled in pretty comfortably in Melbourne. I had some plans to find more work after I finished high school, but I wasn't able to at the time. I lived in Perth, and I think maybe just the way Perth is with restaurants and hospitality, couldn't really find much. After having done my degree and working in a relevant field, I do think this benefit of being able to make money during a gap year comes with you having experience. So like the ability to make and save money is a lot bigger, I guess, after you have the relevant education and experience. But of course, like, there's definitely no downside to a gap year if you're spending at least a portion of it working. And depending on where you are, there are jobs that will take you on with little to no experience, and they do pay quite well. So it really depends kind of like where you are and what circumstances you are at. But at least like spending some portion of your gap year being able to work and save money, that's definitely a big bonus, and it will definitely help you if you plan on studying after and can't work, obviously, as much. And of course, if you don't want to travel, then that's a bonus as well. My other reasons for taking a gap year revolved around ticking things off my bucket list, traveling, and trying to work out if I really did want to be a lawyer. And that leads me to my next point: time. I think having a whole chunk of time is the biggest benefit, and probably the sole reason for why you'd take a year off, because it really gives you a chance to do the things that you can't do if you'd otherwise were studying. And of course, like, the most obvious candidate for this would be traveling. Having a whole year off means that you can take up to several months to go travel somewhere and see more of the world. I spent about 2 months in New Zealand, and this gave me an opportunity to pretty much see the entire country, both islands, and I was able to really stop at a lot of the towns, see like pretty much most of the attractions that New Zealand is known for. And I'd say, like, if there's one thing that I regret about that experience, it's probably that I didn't go away for longer. Another thing that you can do with time off is figure yourself out a little bit more. And it's kind of cliche to say things like, oh, you'll find yourself during a gap year, but having time off from study can really help you pursue other interests, whether it is getting work experience, volunteering, pursuing hobbies, even doing short courses, and you can pursue other interests that are not necessarily within your chosen career. Or alternatively, you can use that time to figure out whether what you want to study, what you want to do, is really the right thing for you to do. In my experience, I haven't done anything that drastically changed what I wanted to do, but it definitely got me out of my set routine that I established during study, and I was able to try new things that I wasn't otherwise able to do when I was studying. And it really gave me a time to step back from study and look at the bigger picture, because I think like doing a very competitive course really gives you a tunnel vision for a particular goal, and that can kind of shut off you from other interests outside of study and work. And the next benefit of taking a gap year is that it's a break in of itself. I really do think that if I'd gone into uni straight after high school, I would have been so burnt out, and I definitely would not have been as passionate for learning or psychology as I am now. And certainly I would not have gotten the grades that I did get during uni. And I think that as much as I didn't want to take a break this year, I was pretty burnt out from honours. So having a break without any deadlines, without any studying and stress, it's, I think, very helpful for me before I go into the next stage. And this is sort of almost kind of related to the previous point, but having a break gives you time to mature. I remember I had such vastly different plans for my career and the way my life was going to go when I was 18. And even in the past 2 years, I've sort of changed what exactly I want to do within psychology. And I think overall as a person, I've really changed. And each year I keep changing and growing and maturing as a person. And I think that's really common for most people my age, because our brain is still developing until we're like age 25. And I think it's just so crazy to think that we're expected to decide what we want to do at 18, 19, even earlier sometimes. So having a year off allows your brain to mature just another extra year, and you can steer on your plans a bit more, and that allows you to make a more informed decision on your future. And now for some downsides. So they're less of like disadvantages or things, reasons against taking a year off, and more things to weigh up before committing to a year off. Now that could be because I might be a little bit biased and I do really see the value of gap years, but I do think that these things can also weigh in your decision against taking a gap year. Judgment. So I definitely think that some people will judge you for taking a year off. In my experience, the only people that really judged me for taking a year off were my parents and maybe some of their friends. And I think it was generally coming from a good place, that they were looking out for me. So I don't think I really experienced any like harsh negative judgment that wasn't warranted. And yeah, it was just mainly a bit of pushback to me taking a year off. And honestly, I think the main reason for why someone, especially your family, might judge you for taking a year off is out of concern for some of the downsides that I'll mention in a tip. And as I mentioned before, in my opinion, I really think that some of these downsides can be managed. In response to other judgment you might get, these people are not living your life. You are. I know it's easier said than done, but if there's anything I learned from listening to other people is that at the end of the day, I am living my life, and I will be the one living with regrets of not having done the thing. So instead of just listening to what other people might think, it's really up to me to do what's best for me. So I think this idea that a gap year is a waste of time is perpetuated by hustle culture, that if you're not studying or working, you're wasting your time. Overall, I think the feeling that you're wasting your time is really subjective. It really depends on whether you perceive how you're spending your time is worthwhile or not, regardless of actually how you spend this time. After year 12, I had really big expectations for a very productive year, and I would beat myself up on the days where I spent just lounging around the house, not doing much. But looking back on it, at the end of the day, I did manage to do quite a bit of stuff. And I also really needed a break after year 12, especially since for the next 3 years, I'd end up working my butt off. And so that time doing nothing wasn't a waste in the end, in my opinion. My one tip to avoid feeling like you're wasting your time is to come up with a rationale for why you want to take a year off, and also come up with a rough plan that aligns with your reasons for taking a gap year. I think my parents were definitely worried that I'd lose momentum and motivation for university after taking a break. But if anything, I think I became more motivated to study. And even taking a break now after I graduated, I am very much looking forward to going back to study. However, I do think that everyone is different in this regard, and some people might actually lose their motivation to continue their studies, especially if they found a well-paying, decent job. So that is definitely something to consider and think about. But then again, if you do lose your motivation to go study and that's because you found an alternative, then that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it'll save you time and money on a degree that might not have been a good fit in the first place. Losing the ability to study, that was definitely something I was a bit afraid of. But I think the way that you study in high school compared to university is quite different. So I don't think I had a problem with studying at university per se. It was just more overall the adjustment that everybody goes through when transitioning from high school to university. So I don't think I could have done much else to prepare. I think taking some time to live by myself in Melbourne before starting my semester helped me a little bit in terms of being self-sufficient, because I think that that's kind of the main difference between high school and university, is the ability to take control and initiative of your own self-learning. And this year, I think I was definitely scared of kind of losing touch with research. And when writing my paper this year, I think I lost some of the ability to write. So I may have lost some ability to study, who knows. But I suppose what I'm losing in terms of study skills now, I'm gaining in work experience. Feeling left behind. So you might think that you'll be a whole year left behind your friends and peers, but in the grand scheme of things, a year is really not such a huge difference, especially if you see how everyone branches out into totally different things from high school. I have friends in high school that are settling down, having children, buying houses, and then friends that have finished postgrad, friends that are just going into uni, friends that are working full-time. No one that I know is really on the same level, if that makes sense. Everyone seems to be doing their own thing on their own terms. I do have to admit that I did get the feeling this year of feeling kind of left behind, and that's because I wanted to keep studying. But yeah, I'll leave this point here. I am planning to talk about this a bit more in depth in another video, probably of part 2 that's focused on involuntary gap years for people like me who missed out on postgrad. And finally, just some things to consider. I think it's important to prepare for things to go wrong or not as how you expect them to. And I suppose this is really relevant nowadays because the COVID situation is so uncertain everywhere. And even for me, like, I was planning on taking this year off to go to Europe, go to Russia if I didn't get into masters, but COVID happened, and so there wasn't really a way for me to go. And I'm sure there's a lot of people with similar stories and in the same boat. And same, during my gap year after high school, I had so many expectations and lofty, ambitious plans that never came to fruition. So the point that I'm trying to get across is that things might not necessarily go the way you plan them to, and that's okay. I think part of life is being able to reframe these unexpected things into positives. So I guess this year, instead of traveling, I ended up having a chance to work full-time, save money, and also reconnect with some of the creative things that I used to love doing. And whilst I may have not completed my bucket list after high school, I managed to take a break, rest, and I stopped myself from getting prematurely burnt out at uni. And another thing to consider is when to take a gap year. Now, there's nothing wrong with taking a gap year at each point, I guess, stopping point in time. But I think the benefits slightly differ depending what stage of life you're at and what stage of study. I found that taking a gap year right after high school didn't grant me a huge amount of independence compared to taking a gap year now. And mainly that's because I lived at home and I also only worked 10 hours. So I couldn't do too much things financially. And after having completed my degree and having more part-time work experience, having more life experience, I'm a lot more independent than I was after having completed high school. So I think that's definitely something to think about, whether you want to put off taking a gap year for when you're a bit more mature and have more life experience and are more independent. And also there are gap year programs that are only accessible to people who have just finished high school. I think the Australian Defence Force has a gap year program as an example. And also likewise, there are also internships and graduate work programs that are only available to uni graduates. So that's definitely something that you need to consider and plan around. That definitely could be a decisive factor in when to take a gap year. And this leads me to my next point. At the start of this video, I mentioned that it's good to think about the reasons for why you want to take a gap year. And I think it's really good to take a step further and plan it. But you want to plan it in a way that gives you a little bit of wiggle room in case things don't work out. Even maybe having a couple of backup plans that you'll be pretty happy with in case your situation changes. I think the thing to consider when planning a gap year is to not overplan, so that if things don't go the way you planned it, then you won't be disappointed. Also, that you don't plan too many things that it becomes a sort of pressure for you to get all these things done. But at the same time, you shouldn't underplan either, because it's so easy to let weeks and months and the entire year to fly past without you having accomplished the reason why you set out to have a gap year in the first place. So if the main reason for your gap year is to do nothing and rest, as contradictory as it sounds, it's definitely a good idea to think about how you might want to do that. And finally, you don't have to take a gap year at all necessarily. You can always take half a year off, or just a couple of months, or simply just reduce your study or workload and do it part-time. In hindsight, I think I definitely would have benefited from taking at least a semester on a reduced study load, or even doing honors part-time. So this is definitely a good option if you're worried about wasting time or losing momentum, as at least you're still spending some of that time doing the things you got to do, and you still have time to do the things that you want to do. So yeah, hopefully this gives you some points to think about if you're considering taking a gap year. Do let me know in the comments if you're thinking about taking a gap year and what you will plan on doing, or if you already took a gap year at some point in your life. I'm very curious to hear what you've done. So thank you for watching. Keep an eye out for part 2, and see you guys next time.